A crumpled $5 bill slid across the table like it had somewhere better to be. It was past midnight. Rain hammered the windows of a half-empty diner on the south side of Chicago, and Jade Ellis was running on fumes. 2 doubles back to back, her feet swollen inside her shoes, a ponytail that had given up 3 hours ago. She was the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. The kind that settles into your bones and stays there. The kind that only mothers who are also their child's only parent truly understand. But she kept moving. Because that's what you do when your little girl is waiting at home with an inhaler that's almost empty and a landlord who doesn't accept excuses. You keep moving. You keep smiling at tables that don't tip. You keep refilling coffee for people who look past you like you're part of the furniture. You keep going because stopping isn't a luxury you can afford. The diner was called Mel's. It had been there since 1987, and it looked every year of it. The kind of place where the booths had duct tape on the corners and the pie was still homemade and the regulars knew each other's names. Jade had worked there for 4 years. She knew every crack in the ceiling, every sticky spot on the floor near the kitchen door, every customer who was going to be difficult before they even opened their mouth. She had learned to read people the way some people read weather. You had to, in a job like hers. So when the bell above the door chimed at 12:43 in the morning and a man shuffled in from the rain, Jade looked up out of habit, and she paused. He was old, maybe late 70s, soaking wet from the outside. His coat the kind of heavy wool that absorbs water like a sponge, his shoes wrapped at the toe with what looked like electrical tape. He smelled of cold nights and damp pavement and something else underneath that, something like a man who had been carrying too much for too long. His hands shook as he reached for the back of a chair. His eyes moved around the room slowly. Not like someone lost, but like someone who had forgotten they were allowed to be somewhere warm. He made his way to booth 6 and sat down without asking if he could, just folded himself into the seat like his body was grateful for it. Jade watched him for a moment. Then she watched Gary, the night manager, start moving in that direction with the particular energy of someone about to ask a person to leave. Gary wasn't a bad man. He was a man who had learned that appearances cost money, and this one looked like it might cost the diner a few of the late-night regulars who were still nursing their coffee at the counter. Jade moved first. She got there before Gary did. She slid between them, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she was just doing her rounds, like she hadn't just made a decision that was going to come out of her own pocket at the end of the night. "Hey there," she said, her voice easy, warm. The voice she used when she wanted someone to feel like they'd just walked into somewhere safe. "Cold out there tonight, huh? What can I get you?" The old man looked up at her. His eyes were grey and clear and sharp, in a way that his clothes didn't suggest. He studied her face for just a second, like he was checking if the kindness was real or performed. Then something in him seemed to settle. "Just coffee," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, educated in a way that caught her off guard for just a moment. "If that's all right." "Coffee's always all right," Jade said. "You eaten tonight?" He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. She brought him coffee, a bowl of the beef stew that was still warm in the back, 2 rolls of bread and a glass of water. She moved him to the table closest to the heating vent without making a production of it. Just said the draft was bad over there and gestured for him to follow, and he did. She put it all on her tab. She didn't tell him. She just did it. And then she went back to work. Back to wiping counters and refilling cups and pretending she hadn't just spent $14 she didn't have on a stranger who hadn't asked her to. Gary gave her a look from across the diner. She gave him one back that said, "Let it go." He let it go. What Jade did not know, what nobody in that diner knew, what nobody in that entire city could have guessed, was that the shaking old man in booth 6 was Walter Gaines. Not a name everyone knew by face, but a name that moved markets. A name that appeared on the sides of buildings and at the top of financial reports, and in the kind of magazines that only exist in the lobbies of places most people never get invited into. One of the 10 wealthiest men in the country, maybe the wealthiest you had never heard of. Because Walter Gaines had spent 50 years building an empire, and the last 20 of them making sure he was never the most interesting thing in any room. He was 78 years old, He had built Gaines Holdings from a single logistics company. He started in his late 20s with borrowed money and an idea he refused to let go of. Over the decades, it had grown into something almost incomprehensible. Real estate across 14 states, infrastructure contracts, a private equity arm, a foundation that bore his name, but that he had mostly stopped paying attention to years ago. His net worth, depending on the quarter, landed somewhere between $8 and $12 billion. He had a penthouse in Manhattan and a house in Aspen and a property in coastal Portugal that he had visited twice. He had also, 3 weeks before that night, been told by a doctor with careful hands and a voice trained to deliver impossible news that he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer and approximately 4 months to live. The clock had stopped being theoretical. Walter had sat in that doctor's office for a long time after the man left the room. He had looked at the painting on the wall, a generic watercolor of a lake somewhere, the kind of thing chosen specifically to be inoffensive and calming. And he had thought about what the rest of his life actually looked like. Who would be in the room? What would matter? What he would leave behind and what it would do once it was out of his hands. That evening, he had called his children. Derek Gaines was 51 years old, polished, handsome in the way that money tends to produce. A man who had grown up knowing he would inherit something significant and had built his personality around that knowledge. He ran one of the subsidiaries with reasonable competence and complete arrogance. He had his father's intelligence and none of his hunger. Simone Gaines Whitfield was 48, sharper than her brother in most ways that mattered, and more dangerous for it. She sat on the board of 2 non-profits and attended the right galas and smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned early that charm was a tool, and tools were meant to be used. Walter told them both at the same time, on a video call, because he didn't trust himself to do it twice in person without losing something he needed to hold on to. Derek's first question, after a pause that was maybe 4 seconds long, was about the controlling interest structure and whether the transition plan had been reviewed by the legal team. Simone's face did something complicated for a moment, something that might have been real grief briefly surfacing before it was managed back down. And then she asked whether the health directives had been updated and whether the asset protection trusts were still structured the way they had discussed 2 years ago during the estate review. Neither of them asked how he felt. Neither of them asked if he was in pain. Neither of them said, "I love you," or "I'm scared," or "I don't want to lose you." And Walter, sitting alone in a room with 12-foot ceilings and a view of the Manhattan skyline that had once made him feel powerful, understood something with a clarity that only terminal diagnosis can produce. He had spent 50 years building something, and the people closest to him saw it only as something to consume. He didn't sleep that night, or the night after. On the third night, somewhere around 3 in the morning, an idea surfaced. It wasn't dramatic when it came. It arrived quietly, the way the truest ideas often do, like something that had been waiting at the edge of his mind for years. Patient, inevitable. If the people who shared his blood couldn't be trusted, perhaps the question wasn't about blood at all. Perhaps the question was about character. And if character was what he was looking for, then he needed to go looking for it in places where his name and his money meant nothing. Walter Gaines decided to disappear. Not literally, not permanently, but completely enough to matter. He told his attorney he was taking a private retreat. He told his household staff he needed 2 weeks of solitude. He had done this before, retreated to some remote property when the noise became too much, so no one questioned it. Then he went into a storage unit in Brooklyn that only he knew about, changed into clothing he had quietly accumulated over the previous months, and walked out into a version of himself that the world had never seen. The experiment lasted 12 days before he found his way to Mel's diner. The results had been, in a word, devastating. Luxury hotels he had stayed in a dozen times refused him entry, not rudely, not with confrontation, simply with the particular smoothness of trained staff who know how to make someone feel like they don't exist without ever saying a word that could be quoted. and a restaurant on the Upper East Side, one where he had eaten no fewer than 30 times, where the maitre d' knew his name and his usual table, had a security guard walk him to the curb within 90 seconds of him stepping inside. The man was professional about it. That almost made it worse. A pharmacy, a park bench, a public library where a security guard followed him through 2 floors before he gave up and left. Everywhere he went, without the armor of money and name, the world looked through him with a consistency that made it impossible to pretend it was accidental. By the 8th day, Walter Gaines had felt something he hadn't felt in decades, not humiliation. He had moved past that, something closer to a grief he couldn't name, not for himself, but for the shape of the world, for what it revealed so reliably, so predictably. About the way human beings actually behaved when there was nothing to gain. He had believed somewhere underneath everything that there were still people who didn't work that way, who helped because it was human to help, who saw a person before they saw a position. He needed to know if that was real or if it was a story he had been telling himself to get through the loneliness of the life he had built. And then it was 12:43 in the morning, and the bell above a diner door chimed, and a woman with tired eyes and a ponytail that had given up hours ago looked up from her counter and didn't look away. Jade Ellis didn't hesitate. That was the thing that Walter kept coming back to later, sitting in the back of his car with rain streaking down the tinted windows. She didn't pause to calculate, and she didn't perform the decision for an audience. There was no audience. Gary was the only one who saw it, and Gary tried to stop her. She just moved. Like it was obvious. Like there was no version of this situation in which she didn't bring a cold, wet stranger something warm. He watched her from booth 6 for the hour he sat there. The way she moved through that diner told him everything. She remembered a regular's birthday and mentioned it without being asked. She split her side work with the newer kid who was clearly overwhelmed. She handled a difficult table with humor and patience and zero cruelty, even when the man at that table made it very easy to justify cruelty. She was good at her job the way people are good at things they have decided to be good at, not because someone is watching, but because it matters to them personally. When Walter finished his food, he reached into the inner lining of his coat where he kept a small amount of cash, part of the reality of the experiment, and placed a $5 bill on the table. It was what he had. It was what felt honest in the context he was inhabiting. Jade came to clear his bowl. She picked up the 5. She looked at it. Then she walked over to him and, without drama, without performance, she pressed it back into his palm. Her hand was warm. Her voice was quiet. "We don't charge guests for kindness here," she said. "You put that back in your pocket." Then she went back to work. Walter sat with those words for a long moment. Then he stood slowly and walked to the door. He paused there for just a second without turning around. Then he pushed out into the rain. In the alley, his driver was waiting. Walter got in and sat down and said nothing for a very long time. The driver, who had worked for him for 11 years and understood the value of silence, did not speak either. Walter was thinking about what it costs to give something when you have almost nothing. He was thinking about the specific quality of Jade's kindness, the way it was entirely free of performance. She hadn't smiled for him. She hadn't made him feel like a charity case. She hadn't done it so she could feel good about herself in the retelling. She had simply acted, at personal cost because it was the right thing to do. And then she had gone back to wiping counters. He had sat in rooms with senators and CEOs and celebrities and billionaires. He had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had shaken hands with people who would appear on the covers of magazines and been told repeatedly by the world that these were the people who mattered, the people who moved things, the people worth knowing. None of them had ever made him feel what he felt sitting in that car in that alley in the rain. He had been looking for proof that humanity still existed beyond boardrooms and bloodlines, and he had found it in a woman who was running on 2 hours of sleep and still chose to spend $14 she probably needed on a stranger she would never see again. The driver finally broke the silence. "Home, sir?" "No," Walter said. "Call Arthur." Tell him I need him at the penthouse in 2 hours." Arthur Belvin had been Walter's personal attorney for 23 years. He was 64, meticulous, and had the particular quality of a man who had seen enough to be unshockable. When he arrived at the penthouse at 3:15 in the morning to find Walter already awake, showered, dressed, and sitting at his desk with a legal pad covered in notes, Arthur simply poured himself a coffee and sat down. "You've made a decision," Arthur said. "I've been making it for 12 days, Walter replied. "I just needed tonight to be certain." He laid it out slowly and completely. The will, the restructuring, everything to a single beneficiary who was not named Gaines. Arthur listened without interrupting, which was his gift. And also, Walter had always believed the reason he was worth every dollar he was paid. When Walter finished, Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They'll challenge it." "I know. They'll go after her. If they can't break the will, they'll try to break her. Drag her history into the light, call it manipulation, paint her as a predator." "I know that too. That's why she can't know. Not yet. Not while I'm alive." Walter leaned forward. "The trust has to be sealed. The beneficiary unnamed in any document that touches their hands. Let them think they've won. Let them show themselves completely. And then, when I'm gone, let the truth land all at once." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "You're certain about this?" "I've never been more certain of anything in 50 years of making decisions." They worked through the night. Trust structures built with the care of architecture, blind timelines, layers of legal protection designed to absorb the inevitable assault. Every door locked before it could be found. Walter had not built an empire by leaving exits unguarded. He applied the same precision now that he had applied to every significant move of his professional life. Except this time the stakes were not financial. The stakes were meaning. Before Arthur left at dawn, Walter said one more thing. "That waitress has more integrity than every person I've put in a position of power for the last 30 years. Whatever she does with what I'm leaving her, it will be more than what my children would have done. I know that now." Arthur nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said, and he left. Walter stood at the window as the city began to lighten. He thought about Jade Ellis, somewhere across the city, probably just getting home. Maybe checking on her daughter before she slept. Probably setting an alarm for a shift that was coming too soon. She had no idea that a single act of unperformed, uncalculated kindness had just redirected the course of a billion-dollar empire. He thought about what she would do with power, not the obvious things. He thought deeper than that. He thought about the way she had moved her other customer away from the draft without making him feel moved. The way she had picked up the $5 bill and given it back without making him feel small. The way she managed the difficult table with patience and zero bitterness. She knew how to hold people's dignity in her hands without crushing it. That was rarer than any business skill he had ever paid to acquire. In the weeks that followed, Walter's penthouse changed temperature. The calls from Derek became shorter and more transactional. Simone began stopping by with a frequency that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with surveillance. She asked about his medications. She asked who was visiting. She asked, with that smile too tight to be entirely sincere, whether he had considered that the stress of whatever he was going through might be affecting his judgment. "People are worried about you," she told him one afternoon, sitting across from him in the living room with her ankles crossed and her eyes doing the work her voice was too careful to do. "The board has noticed some things, running around the city in disguise. It's not a great look, Dad. It makes people nervous." Walter looked at his daughter for a long time. As she was beautiful and intelligent, and she had learned every tool of influence from him without absorbing any of the values that were supposed to accompany them. He felt the grief of that, clearly, the particular grief of a parent who recognizes their own failures reflected back at them. "I appreciate your concern," he said evenly. The next week, a psychiatrist was suggested, then strongly recommended, then arrived at his door with a referral letter that had Derek's fingerprints all over it, though not his signature. It was framed as these things always are, as care, Walter submitted to 2 sessions. The psychiatrist, who was thorough and professional, found nothing to report. That seemed to frustrate certain parties considerably. Private investigators appeared next, subtle but not invisible to a man who had used them himself. They were looking for Jade Ellis before they even knew her name. Looking for whatever woman or influence had made Walter this way made him irrational, because there was no version of this in which they could accept that their father was simply choosing someone else. It had to be manipulation. It had to be outside interference. It could simply not be, that they had failed a test they didn't know they were taking. Jade, meanwhile, lived her life. She worked her shifts. She walked her daughter Amara to school and picked her up. She made grocery lists with the precision of someone who had learned to treat a budget like a puzzle, to be solved with creativity rather than resentment. She called her own mother on Sundays. She was late on rent in November and made it up by December. She was living the life of someone who has decided to be okay, despite the evidence, and is making that decision again every single morning. She had no idea her name was being spoken in lawyers' offices and private dining rooms by people who saw her as a threat to something they considered already theirs. One evening, after Derek left a meeting with Walter in a fury that didn't even try to disguise itself, Walter said the thing he had been holding back for years. He said it quietly, without drama, because there was no drama left in him, just clarity. "You never deserved what I built," he told his son. "And the tragedy is that you never understood why. It wasn't about deserving. It was about what you do with something when it's placed in your hands. That answer told me everything." Derek left without responding, which was, well, Walter thought, in its own way, the most honest thing his son had ever done. Henry's strength was fading visibly now. He slept more. He ate less. Arthur visited weekly. The documents were reviewed, updated, sealed, and reviewed again. The fortress was complete. Whatever came next, it was coming into a structure that had been built specifically to survive it. Walter Gaines died on a Tuesday morning in January, quietly, with a nurse in the room and the city going about its business 12 floors below. There was no dramatic final scene, no deathbed confession, no last words that anyone would remember. Just a man who had spent 50 years being very loud about his presence in the world, finally becoming still. The will was read 9 days later. The library in the penthouse was the kind of room that announced its own importance. Dark wood, tall shelves, books arranged by someone who understood how books should look rather than someone who had actually read them. Light coming through tall windows at an angle that made everything feel historical. Derek sat in the chair on the left. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and the expression of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. He had spent the 9 days since his father's death in near constant communication with a legal team that was very expensive and very confident. Simone sat on the right, legs crossed, one heel tapping a slow rhythm that she stopped when she noticed Arthur noticing it. She had brought her own attorney. He was sitting slightly behind her, a quiet man with a briefcase and the face of someone who specialized in patience. Arthur Belvin stood at the head of the room. He was wearing the same suit he always wore for significant occasions, dark grey, understated, a man communicating through his clothing that what he was about to do was not personal. He began with the formalities, the acknowledgements, the small personal items, a watch collection, a set of first edition books, a car. Derek relaxed fractionally with each item, exchanging a glance with his sister that said this is going as expected. The real numbers would come next. They always came next. Then Arthur turned a page, and his voice didn't change at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. "To my son Derek," Arthur read, "I leave my collection of cufflinks, my fly fishing equipment, and a letter I have written him personally. I leave him no controlling interest in Gaines Holdings, and no cash assets, no equity, and no authority within any subsidiary or affiliate of the company." Derek made a sound, not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, a short, sharp exhale. "That's not right," he said. Read it again. Arthur looked up. I will continue, he said. To my daughter Simone, I leave the portrait of her mother that has hung in the Connecticut house since 1998 and a letter written for her personally. I leave her no equity, no cash assets, no property, no controlling interest, and no authority within Gaines Holdings or any of its affiliated entities. Simone's face went through several things in rapid succession. First confusion, genuine, and unguarded. Then something that looked briefly like pain, then like a door closing, calculation. He was sick, she said, her voice very controlled. His judgment was compromised. This will not hold. Arthur continued without response. The remainder of my estate, he read, all holdings, all properties, all assets, all equity, all interest in Gaines Holdings and its subsidiaries is to be placed in a sealed trust and administered in full to a single-named beneficiary, effective upon the completion of the administrative transition period. Both siblings leaned forward simultaneously. Jade Ellis. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then the room came apart. Derek was on his feet. Simone was speaking over him, her voice sharp and fast. The attorney behind her was already opening his briefcase. The words manipulation and undue influence and mental incapacity arrived in rapid succession. All of them spoken with the practiced fluency of people who had rehearsed for exactly this moment. Arthur let them run. He stood at the head of the room with his hands clasped in front of him and waited with the patience of a man who knew what was in the documents and was not concerned. When the noise thinned enough to speak into, he said, "The will is legally airtight. The trust has been reviewed by 4 independent firms. Your father underwent 2 independent psychiatric evaluations in the months prior to his death, both of which confirmed full cognitive competence. The timeline of these decisions, the documentation of his reasoning, and the legal structure of the transfer have been prepared specifically to withstand challenge. You are welcome to pursue litigation. You will not win." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Simone looked at Derek. Derek looked at the floor. Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly, but something in the same neighborhood. A reckoning with the fact that their father had not simply overlooked them. He had seen them clearly and chosen differently. That was the part that couldn't be undone by any lawsuit. Across the city at Mel's diner, Jade Ellis was on a double shift again. Same flickering light above booth 3 that she had asked Gary to replace 4 times. Same coffee that was a little too strong and a little too old by 8 p.m. Same counter she had wiped down 1,000 times. She was thinking about whether Amara's teacher had responded to her email about the reading program, and whether the weekend tips would cover the gap in this month's budget, and whether she had enough of the good bread left in the kitchen for the late crowd. She was not thinking about Walter Gaines. She had not thought about the old man from booth 6 in weeks. Life had continued the way it always did, filling up every available space with its requirements. The black car pulled up outside at 9:17 p.m. Jade noticed it because it was the kind of car that didn't belong on this block, and everyone in the diner noticed it. A man got out who also didn't belong. Suit. Briefcase. The kind of shoes that meant something. He came to the counter and asked for Jade Ellis by name. Her first feeling was fear. Not excitement. Not curiosity. Fear. The specific fear of a mother who has learned that unexpected things are usually bad things. She thought of Amara. She thought of what terrible thing might have happened that required a man in a suit to deliver it in person. She took off her apron slowly. Gary was watching. She told him with a look that she didn't know what this was and walked to the end of the counter. The man introduced himself as Arthur Belvin. He said he needed to speak with her privately about a matter of significant importance. He said it carefully and calmly, and she could see from the way he was watching her face that he understood this was going to be a lot. He had done this before. He had thought about how to do it. They sat in his car. He talked for a long time. He told her about Walter Gaines. He described carefully what Walter Gaines was worth. He explained what had been left to her and what that meant in practical terms. He told her about the trusts and the protections and what would happen next. He told her about Derek and Simone and what they were likely to do and what was in place to handle it. Jade sat very still through all of it. When Arthur finished, she said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, "The old man from booth 6. "Yes," Arthur said. "He was testing people." "Yes." Another pause. "And he picked me." Arthur nodded. Jade looked out the window at the diner. The flickering light above booth 3 was visible from here. She could see Gary behind the counter, pretending not to watch. She thought about Amara. She thought about the $5 bill she had pressed back into a stranger's hand because it didn't feel right to take it. "I need to think," she said finally. "Of course," Arthur said. "Take whatever time you need. I'll leave you my card and all the documents. I'm available whenever you're ready." She got out of the car and went back inside and finished her shift. She wiped down the counter. She helped the new kid restock the napkin holders. She said goodnight to the regulars. She drove home, checked on Amara, who was asleep, and sat in her kitchen for a very long time in the dark. What followed was not a fairy tale. It was harder than that, and more real than that, and more meaningful than that. The legal challenges came exactly as Arthur had predicted. Derek's team was aggressive and well-funded, and they used every available tool. The story hit the media in a version that had been shaped carefully to make Jade look predatory. A con artist, a gold digger who had manipulated a sick old man in a vulnerable moment. There were headlines. There were people on television using her name with a certainty that had nothing to do with knowing her. Jade had to hire a publicist for the first time in her life, all which was a sentence she had never once imagined forming. She had to sit across from attorneys and answer questions about a single night she had barely thought about since it happened. She had to explain over and over that she hadn't known, that she had given back the $5 because it was the right thing to do, that there was no scheme, that she had just brought soup to a cold man because he looked like he needed it. The courts ultimately found, consistently and completely, in her favor. But the harder thing wasn't the courts. The harder thing was becoming what she had been handed. Jade was not naive about money. She had thought about it her whole life, but from the other direction, from the side of not having enough, from the side of counting it and stretching it and losing sleep over it. Having too much of it was its own kind of problem, different in every way but still a problem, because money at that scale is not just money. It is influence and responsibility and 100 different versions of a question she had never been asked before. What do you stand for? What will you protect? What kind of thing do you want to be in the world? She thought about Walter, not the billionaire, the man in booth 6. She thought about what he had been looking for, what he had not found in 12 days of searching before he walked through the door of Mel's diner. She thought about what it meant that she had been the answer to that search, not because she was exceptional, but because she had simply not made the choice to look away. She decided to start there. And the first thing she did was sit down with Arthur and the finance team and ask them to walk her through everything. Every holding, every asset, every subsidiary, not to make decisions immediately, but to understand. She showed up to those meetings with a notebook and questions and a willingness to say, "I don't know what that means. Explain it to me," which turned out to be its own kind of leadership. She kept Amara in the same school, same neighborhood, same friends, same Tuesday night soup tradition that had carried them through the hardest years. Normalcy was not something she took for granted. She had learned its value too specifically. The second thing she did was walk through the Gaines Holdings employee roster. All of it. Every level. She asked for information about medical leave, about turnover patterns, about which departments had the highest rates of people quietly quitting. She found a warehouse operation in New Jersey where workers had been filing complaints about conditions for 2 years with no response. She addressed it personally. She flew there, walked the floor, talked to people, then changed the conditions. Not because it was good public relations, though it was. Because it was obviously right. She turned 3 vacant Gaines properties in Chicago into transitional housing facilities for families coming out of shelters. She didn't name them after Walter or after herself. She didn't name them at all. Just opened them. She called her mother Moore. That part cost her nothing except time, and time had reorganized itself. She paid off every medical debt attached to every employee at the diner. All of them. Gary called her when he found out, and she could hear that he was trying not to cry, and she told him it was nothing, and he said, "Jade, that is not nothing," and she said, "I know," and they left it there. She went back to Mel's once about 8 months after the night the black car pulled up. She sat in a booth near the window and ordered coffee and the beef stew, which was exactly as she remembered it. She left a tip that made the server stop and look at her. She smiled and said, "Have a good night," and walked out. She still thought about the $5 bill sometimes. How small it had seemed. How ordinary that moment had been. She hadn't felt herself making a decision. She had just moved. And the moving of it had somehow set in motion something so far beyond anything she could have planned or imagined or schemed toward that the absurdity of it still landed differently every time she turned it over. "Wealth doesn't reveal character," Walter had written in the letter he left for her. A letter Arthur had given her the night in the car before she went back to finish her shift. "Wealth tests it. What I have placed in your hands is not a reward. It is a question. The only answer that matters is what you do when no one is watching. I already know your answer. I saw it on a Tuesday night in a diner on the south side of Chicago. I was watching. I was the only one watching, and that was exactly the point." She had read that letter 4 times in her kitchen that night. She had folded it back up and put it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered. There is something this story keeps returning to, something that sits underneath all of it. Underneath the empire and the will and the courtrooms and the headlines. Something quieter than all of that. Jade Ellis was not kind that night because she thought it would be rewarded. She was not strategic. She was not positioning herself. She was a tired woman at the end of a brutal shift who saw another human being who needed something and decided that the cost of meeting that need was a cost she was willing to absorb. $14. A conversation with her manager. The $5 bill pressed back into a stranger's palm. She didn't know who was watching. She didn't know anyone was watching. And that is the whole point of the story. Because the truth is that we are always, in some way, demonstrating who we are. In the small moments, the ones that feel inconsequential, the ones where no one seems to be paying attention, the ones where we have every reasonable excuse to look away. We are always showing the people around us and ourselves what we actually believe about other people and about what we owe each other. Walter Gaines spent 12 days walking through a world that had every opportunity to show him something worth believing in. And it failed him, almost entirely. Until one moment in one diner with one woman who didn't think twice. You never know who is standing in front of you. You never know which moment is the one that echoes forward in ways you can't predict or calculate or even imagine. You never know which choice is the one that defines something. As what you do know is who you are in the moment when you have to choose. When it costs you something. When no one is watching. When there is nothing to gain. That is the only version of yourself that is real. Everything else is performance. If you were Jade, what do you do with that $5 bill? Do you take it because you need it and you've earned it and there's no reason not to? Or do you press it back into the hand of a stranger who might need it more, even though you're not sure you can afford to? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know how you think. I want to know what kind of person you believe yourself to be in that moment. And if this story stayed with you, if it landed somewhere real, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to City of Tales. Turn on your notifications. Because the stories we tell here are not meant to entertain you and disappear. They are meant to stay. They are meant to ask you something about yourself on the way out. Walter Gaines built an empire with capital and strategy, and 50 years of relentless work. Jade Ellis rebuilt it with something that couldn't be learned in any boardroom, couldn't be purchased with any trust fund, couldn't be inherited by any child who hadn't earned it. She rebuilt it with the quiet, costly, uncalculated decision to treat a stranger like he mattered. And somewhere in a city that keeps moving whether you're watching or not, that decision is still echoing. The smallest choices write the longest chapters.